So now we're going to discuss how to interpret connections between the first house and the eighth house. And how will such connections form? Well, for example, you could have the first lord in the eighth house. You could have the eighth lord in the first house. You could have the two lords joining somewhere, or you could have them mutually aspecting each other. But most of all, what I'm really interested in discussing is if you have 8 and 1 in sequence or on opposite ends of the code, the DNA code that describes the configuration of the houses in your birth chart. And if you don't know that code for yourself, you can go to victicara.com/H, or you can look in the description below the video. You'll get a link there. You can order that report, and this code is a part of that report. It's called Houses of Life. So the first and the eighth house, they have a lot of harmonious synergy with each other. I will describe the 3 most important ones to you. Here's a case where the sequencing in the code is not really exactly the same in its effect as the placement of lords in these houses and so forth. So in the second part of the video, I'm going to describe how it would differ depending on how you're connecting the first lord and the eighth lord. But first, let's just look at the synergies between the 2 houses and what we would interpret from those synergies. Okay? So the first synergy between the first and the eighth house is that the first house is the house of birth and the eighth house is the house of reproduction. Reproduction leads to, is birth. So what you expect from a person whose chart has connection between the first and eighth house is that they're pretty good with birth or reproduction. In other words, they're fertile, they're sexy, they have libido, they have charisma, not just for literal sex, but also for just the acts of creativity of which sex is primary. So, for example, you expect this person to be productive and want to produce things and want to create things. A second very important synergy is quite related to the first. It's the fact that the first is the house of health, because it's the house of your body, the thing which is born. So it's the house of the health of the body. And the eighth house is the house of life force, because life force is what creates reproduction. So what do you expect? You expect a lot of vitality. You expect a lot of life force, good health, longevity, youthful energy which persists into old age. The third important synergy between the first and the eighth house is that the first is the house of visibility, and the eighth is the house of, let's call it, unsecret. So, to explain, the first is the house of visibility because this is where the sun rises, this is where things are born. Being born means becoming visible. The eighth is above the western horizon, so it's the detractor of the sunset symbolism. It's the eroder of sunset symbolism. So the eighth house actually concerns all the things which remove invisibility or reveal hidden things to us. This is why the eighth house has to do with occult, astrology, psychology, mysticism, spirituality, and so forth. And it's also why the eighth house has to do with critique, criticism, going behind the curtains, going under the hood, and really seeing what's true behind the scenes. So, this is harmonious. The first house is about visibility, and the eighth house is about disclosing secrets, making invisible things visible. So what to expect in a chart where the first and eighth house are connected? Expect the person to have a lot of insight. Expect them to be perceptive, like piercing in their perceptions. Don't expect them to be suckers. Expect them to be street smart or savvy. They know how people work. They know how lies are told. And so they're not easy to deceive. They're good at discovering the truth even when someone else is trying to hide it. And they're also good at revealing things or showing things which others can't see. On the other hand, there is one sort of downside perhaps from this, is that you will get a disconnect from physicality. You should expect disconnect from physicality. The eighth house is wrapped up with invisibility. Sure, it's disclosing invisibility, but it's very obsessed with invisible things. So in this sense, it's a bit opposite to the first house, which is obsessed with visible things. And so this is a bit of a clash as well, simultaneous to it being harmonious. And so one of the side effects here also is to be a disconnect with physicality, so the person may not feel like they're actually in their body, they may not feel like they belong to their body, etc., or they may not really enjoy the physical world very well, which is interesting because they're sexy and they're interested in reproduction and stuff. So it's going to be a psychological type of sexiness. It's not just a brute physical sexiness usually. Now, what I said in the beginning of the video was that there's some differences in whether you're lining up 1 and 8 in the house code, or whether you're putting First Lord in the 8th house and so forth. So let me briefly go over those situations. The best way to get these basically good effects from conjoining the 1st and the 8th house is to have an 8 followed by a 1 in your house code. Second best way is to have a 1 followed by 8. 8 followed by 1 is slightly better, because 8th house signifies the invisibility and the 1 signifies the tangibility. So when you have 1 supporting 8, it will be bringing tangibility into the invisible realm, and you'll be getting more of these good effects that we described. If it's 1 by 8, it's still great, but it's a little bit more like invisibility is supporting the visible thing. So you'll have psychology supporting physicality, which is great. But I would say you'll get the fullest goodness if it's 8 followed by 1, and a close runner-up is 1 followed by 8. Then the second thing to consider is if they're poles, if they're on the opposite ends of the code, you won't get the good versions of these things. You'll have these things being at odds with each other. So you'll have infertility, or lack of charisma, or difficulty with sexuality, a lack of vitality, a lack of energy, and lack of street smarts, lack of savvy, lack of awareness of how lies work. If you have the First Lord in the 8th house or the 8th Lord in the 1st house, let's discuss those for a second. Neither one of those situations is really going to be great and give you these results, but let me explain why. The First Lord, if it goes to the 8th house, you get these nice synergies out of it, but one of the side effects is the Lord will not be able to see its house. Planets see things by their aspect, and every planet is blind to 150 degrees. It's blind to its 6th house. So if you put the First Lord in the 8th house, that makes the 1st house the 6th from it, right? So putting the First Lord in the 8th house weakens the 1st house because the Lord can't see it anymore. And it's an important principle that the better the Lord of house can see the house, the better the house is going to flourish. So that's a general principle. However, what I want you to actually do when you're actually looking at your chart or somebody else's chart is look at the actual degree of the First Lord in the 8th sign from the ascendant, and then look at the actual degree of the ascendant. The closer they are to 150, the less you should expect any of these good effects. But the more they veer towards 120 or 180, which they can veer quite a bit, the more that you would expect to get good effects, the good effects that we spoke about. So that's how to deal with First Lord in the 8th house. 8th Lord in the 1st house, you'll basically get these same effects, but they may not always be in their fully good form. The reason for that is that because the 8th house drills into things and uncovers the inner working, the 8th Lord tends to crack wherever it goes and dig into wherever it goes. So putting the 8th Lord in the 1st house tends to put a crack into the physicality. And kind of a sense of self-critique. So that you'll be getting these good effects that we described, but they'll be concomitant with self-critique, which often works against them. And in the other two scenarios where you can have the first and the eighth lord aspecting each other or conjoining with each other, then you basically get these good effects, but you should maybe just qualify that against how friendly the planets are with each other, the particular planets that could be the eighth or first lord. Thank you very much. This was a exciting and interesting video to do for you. I hope you enjoyed it a lot. Again, if you don't have the code of your house sequence, then go to the link below and order one of those reports. Thank you.